Hi there and welcome back. My name is Charlotte. I'm sorry that it's been a little bit of time since I last posted a video, but it's just been a really busy semester and I really haven't felt like, using my spare time to sit down and make a video for a little while, but I'm finally back in the mood, decided that I would put something together. And this video in particular was kind of born from a place of bitterness because I just keep seeing these certain fantasy authors described as having really atmospheric writing or the best vibes or the most lyrical prose. And I really disagree with that, but I'm not going to be shady and name names here. I might talk about some of that later in a different video, but for now, I decided that I want to be positive instead and share my favorite fantasy authors who create to me like the most evocative imagery, the best atmosphere, and have the most beautiful writing that I've encountered, and who I also think are really underrated or not spoken about very often anymore. Like poetic, strange, dreamy fantasy is my favorite kind of fantasy, and I've really tried to go out of my way to read a lot of it over time. So I hope that sharing this with you will help you discover some really talented artists who might be a bit off the beaten path or not as well known as they once were. I, of course, had to start off this list with Sofia Samitar, who is a professor of literature. She's a poet, and she is the author of a lot of nonfiction as well as fiction. For me specifically, I really love her fantasy books. I love all of her stuff that I've read, but particularly her fantasy books, which are set in a land called Alondria. They're called A Stranger in Alondria and The Winged Histories, and they follow the precipitating events of and then the course of a civil war in this country called Alondria. And I decided that Samitar had to be on this list because her books are both really incredibly written and I think very underrated. When you're reading the Alondria book specifically, you really get a sense of it as this country with a very complicated history and this rich culture. And the writing is a big part of that. There are especially a lot of these like little excerpts of poems and songs and stories that are woven throughout. And especially in the first book, A Stranger in Alondria, you really come to see it along with the main character as this place that is beautiful but not just simple because it's beautiful, and there's this very strong sense of like longing and nostalgia and sorrow, both for the place itself and kind of the character's imagining of what the place was before he came to it. So I decided that I was going to read an excerpt from each book so you could get an idea of how the author writes. So this is going to be the very start of A Stranger in Alondria. I actually realized that I have an ARC copy of the book that's signed by Sofia Samitar, which is really cool. I didn't realize that for a while. I guess I had missed the signature, but yeah, that's kind of cool. So this is the start of A Stranger in Alondria. As I was a stranger in Alondria, I knew nothing of the splendor of its coasts, nor of Bane, the harbor city, whose lights and colors spill into the ocean like a cataract of roses. I did not know the vastness of the spice markets of Bane, where the merchants are delirious with scents. I had never seen the morning mist adrift above the surface of the green alune, of which the poets sing. I had never seen a woman with gems in her hair, nor observed the copper glinting of the domes, nor stood upon the melancholy beaches of the south, while the wind brought in the sadness from the sea. Deep within the Phaeoliath, the country of the wines, the clarity of light can stop the heart. It is a light that local people call the breath of angels, and is said to cure heart sickness and bad lungs. Beyond this is the Balin Vale, where in the winter months the people wear caps of white squirrel fur, and in the summer months the goddess Love is said to walk, and the earth is carpeted with almond blossom. But of all this I knew nothing. I knew only of the island where my mother oiled her hair in the glow of a rush candle, and terrified me with stories of the ghost with no liver, whose sandals slap when he walks because he has his feet on backward. The next author who I just knew that I had to talk about for this video is Patricia McCree. She is one of my very favorite fantasy authors. She died in 2022 and she left behind a legacy of mostly fantasy, a few other things. And she wrote a lot of these very short, contained little standalone fantasy novels. Each one has these very iconic covers by the artist Kanuko Craft, which I'll put a few on the screen, and I highly suggest that you look up her art because she's a very talented artist. I kind of think of each one of these as like its own sort of self-contained little gem. It often has these very fairy tale-esque elements. Her writing is very dreamy and soft with a lot of beautiful imagery and lots of little magical details. There's usually at least one kind of main like sensory focus for the book. So for example, in the book of Atrix Wolf, there are a lot of really incredible descriptions of food, and in Umbria and Shadow, there are lots of details describing this strange magical city where it's set. She often has these sort of ensemble casts of characters whose stories all come together, and I was realizing when I read the most recent book that I read by her that they always manage to feel like very real and human to me, and I care about them, even though the books are pretty short and they aren't like what I would call like deeply psychological or character-driven works. So there's just a really special combination of things going on with her books, I think. I had a really hard time choosing a sample passage for her because I've read the most of her books out of any of these authors, and there are just so many passages to choose from, and I wanted to make sure that I chose like the absolutely right one. But what I ended up choosing is from one of her books called Song for the Basilisk, and I have it here. He could not find his way out of the hinterlands. East turned into south or north. The moon and sun had changed direction. He had misplaced an ocean. The hills were no longer empty. He kept meeting people in small villages who pointed him in one direction or another and then distracted him. They offered him food, asked him to sing a story, and gave him odd things to play. He told them the tale of the bard and his dream. They knew the tale and the firebone pipe. There was one in the next village, they heard, and told him how to find it. In the next village, he found the same vague rumors of the pipe. In the next valley there was one, or perhaps beside the lake. I must get home, he told them urgently. They pointed him east, and he got lost. They all seemed gentle, kindly people. He could find no reason for the dead. He asked them, but they listened as if he told some long-forgotten story or a dream. He had traveled into the land of the dead and played for them. That they somehow knew. Now he could play anything. The trees listened to his picochet and opened new leaves. Birds answered bone pipes he made, and he understood their language. He played a whistle made of a raven's feather and asked the ravens to find his way back to the sea. They led him here and there to listen to a flute that only women could play, to gourds that hissed and rattled the language of snakes. Home, he told the ravens, but they could not follow his heart's path, he knew. Luli was no longer home. Home was south, under a burning sky, in a city of stone ringed by water. Home was a place where his name could not be spoken. Home was a reflection in the basilisk's eye, into which he must move without being seen. Okay, and the next author I chose is Robin McKinley. And Robin McKinley and Patricia McKillip, I think they often get mentioned and suggested together, and I understand why, because they both started writing in like the 70s and 80s. They're both known for their prose and these very like dreamy fairy tale vibes. I would say that their styles are very distinct though, because I think of McKinley as being like a lot quirkier and more eccentric. Her writing tends to have a lot of these like run-on sentences and random asides and kind of stream of consciousness paragraphs that like veer off into their own direction. And there's this very strong sense of like wryness and like kind of quirkiness in her narrative voice. She is also a very passionate animal lover and a gardener, so a lot of her books feature like a lot of gardening and a lot of really wonderful descriptions of animals and pets and things like that. She has written a lot of fairy tale retellings. My favorite of those is one of her darker works, Deerskin, which is a retelling of the fairy tale Donkey Skin. She also wrote an urban fantasy book, Sunshine, which is about vampires, which I don't remember that well, but I just remember having like the most incredible descriptions of baked goods in any book that I've ever read. So yeah, she's written like a lot of different things, but there's often like a lot of really cozy details and this kind of like quirky writing style to it. The one that I thought really showed that pretty well in the beginning of the book is Spindle's End, and so I'll start with that. The magic in that country was so thick and tenacious that it settled over the land like chalk dust, and over floors and shelves like slightly sticky plaster dust. House cleaners in that country earned unusually good wages. If you lived in that country, you had to descale your kettle of its incrustation of magic at least once a week, because if you didn't, you might find yourself pouring hissing snakes or pond slime into your teapot instead of water. It didn't have to be anything scary or unpleasant like snakes or slime, especially in a cheerful household. Magic tended to reflect the atmosphere of the place in which it found itself. But if you want a cup of tea, a cup of lavender and gold pansies or ivory thimbles is unsatisfactory. And while the pansies, put dry in a vase, would probably last a day, looking like ordinary pansies before they went grayish dun and collapsed into magic dust, something like an ivory thimble would begin to smudge and crumble as soon as you picked it up. The best way to do it was to have a fairy as a member of your household because she, it was usually a she, could lay a finger on the kettle just as it came to a boil. Absent-minded fairies could often be recognized by a pad of scar tissue on the finger they favored for kettle cleaning, and murmur a few counter-magical words. There would be a tiny inaudible thunk, like a seed pod bursting, and the water would stay water for another week, or maybe 10 days. The next person I chose is Tannis Lee, who's a really important name to know just for historical reasons, like if you really want to know your important female authors in science fiction and fantasy. She wrote a little bit of everything, but mostly fantasy, sci-fi, and horror, and she also wrote a lot of children's books. She was super prolific. I was looking at her bibliography for this video and was just like amazed by how many things she published over the course of her career. And at least for her adult fiction, I've read some of her adult stuff and some of her children's stuff. I would say for her adult work, they are often quite dark and violent and sexual. Her style is like lush and descriptive, almost to the point of kind of feeling suffocating. And so you combine that with the content of the stories, and the feeling of reading her books is like very decadent, but also unsettling at the same time. My favorite of hers that I've read is probably Knight's Master, which is this interconnected collection of short stories, which I think is kind of inspired by 1001 Nights. Their stories are all about this prince of demons and his interference in the lives of mortals. So I thought I would read a little bit from that. Okay. So it goes. The palace itself, black iron without, black marble within, was lit by the changeless light of the underneath, a radiance as colorless and cool as earthly starlight, though many times more brilliant, and this light streamed into the halls of Azrarn through large casements of black sapphire, or somber emerald, or the darkest ruby. Outside lay a garden of many terraces where grew immense cedars with silver trunks and jet-black leaves, and flowers of colorless crystal. Here and there was a pool like a mirror in which swam bronze birds, while lovely fish with wings perched in the trees and sang, for the laws of nature were immensely different beneath the ground. At the center of Azran's garden a fountain played. It was composed not of water but of fire, a scarlet fire that gave neither light nor heat. Beyond the palace walls lay the vast and marvelous city, its towers of opal and steel and brass and jade, rising up into the glow of the never-altering sky. No sun ever rose and drew him Vanashta. The city of demons was the city of darkness, a thing of the night. The next author I chose to talk about is Katherine Valentine, and I'll preface this part by saying that she is definitely a very eclectic author, and she seems to kind of try something different with almost every new project she works on, and I've liked pretty much everything that I've read by her, but the duology that really fits with this video's overall theme is the Orphan's Tales duology, which starts with In the Night Garden. This is also an interconnected collection of short stories that I think are very inspired by 1001 Nights and fairy tales. And the really cool thing about the structure of this collection is that they're all like nested within each other. So you'll be hearing like a story narrated by a witch, but then that leads into another story by an evil hedgehog, and then that leads into a story by a selkie before you gradually like work your way back out to the original story with all of these nested stories weaving together by the end. And a lot of them are quite grisly and dark in the way that we think of classic fairy tales as being, but there's also a lot of whimsy and humor, and I think just great creativity to them. I love this collection, and it's another one that I think is very underrated, and I would love to have more people read it. So I will start by reading the beginning of the first book, In the Night Garden. Once there was a child whose face was like the new moon shining on cypress trees and the feathers of water birds. She was a strange child full of secrets. She would sit alone in the great palace garden on winter nights, pressing her hands into the snow and watching it melt under the heat. She wore a crown of garlic greens and wisteria. She drank from the silver fountain studded with lapis. She ate cold pears under a canopy of pines on rainy afternoons. Now this child had a strange and wonderful birthmark, in that her eyelids and the flesh around her eyes were stained a deep indigo black, like ink pooled in china pots. It gave her the mysterious, taciturn look of an owl on ivory rafters, or a raccoon drinking from the swift-flowing river. It colored her eyes such that when she was grown she would never have to smoke her eyelashes with coal. For this mark she was feared, and from her earliest days the girl was abandoned to wander the garden round the many-towered palace. Her parents regarded her with trepidation and terror, wondering if her deformity reflected poorly on their virtue. The other nobles firmly believed that she was a demon sent to destroy the glittering court. Their children, who often roamed the garden like a flock of wild geese, kept away from her, lest she curse them with her terrible powers. The Sultan could not decide. After all, if she were a demon, it would not do to offend her infernal kin by doing away with her like so much cut grass. In the end, all preferred that she simply remained silent and far away, so that none would have to confront the dilemma. And so it went like this for many years, while 13 summers, like fat orange roses, sprang and withered. So of course this kind of list would not be complete without Angela Carter, who I think in the fantasy world is most known for her collections of fairy tale retellings, especially this collection, The Bloody Chamber. The story that it's most famous for is also The Bloody Chamber, which is this gothic retelling of Bluebeard. I read this collection a few years ago and I loved it. And of the authors that I've already mentioned, I think that I would probably say that Angela Carter's style is the closest to Tannis Lee, and that there's a lot of like darkness and horror and sexuality to their writing, and the prose is really beautiful and like intricate and ominous and luscious all at once. So there's a lot of really good things I could have chosen to read from here, but for some reason the part that I always remember is from the short story in the collection, The Earl King, and this is describing like an erotic encounter with this kind of like otherworldly supernatural being. I didn't remember until I was reading back for this project that there's like some vor involved, but you know what? We're just gonna go with it, okay? So yeah, this is from The Earl King. He strips me to my last nakedness, that underskin of mauve, pearlized satin, like a skinned rabbit, then dresses me again in an embrace so lucid and encompassing it might be made of water, and shakes over me dead leaves, as if into the stream I have become. Sometimes the birds at random, all singing, strike a chord. His skin covers me entirely. They're like two halves of a seed, enclosed in the same integument. I should like to grow enormously small so that you could swallow me, like those queens in fairy tales who conceive when they swallow a grain of corn or a sesame seed. Then I could lodge inside your body and you would bear me. The candle flutters and goes out. His touch both consoles and devastates me. I feel my heart pulse then weather, naked as a stone, on the roaring mattress, while the lovely moony night slides through the window to dapple the flanks of this innocent, who makes cages to keep the sweet birds in. Eat me, drink me, thirsty, cankered, goblin-ridden, I go back and back to him to have his fingers strip the tattered skin away and clothe me in his dress of water, this garment that drenches me, its slithering odor, its capacity for drowning. I also want to mention Allison Gorman, who wrote a young adult fantasy quartet called The Books of Pelennor back in the early 2000s, and she's written a few other things since then. So the Books of Pelennor are very clearly inspired by The Lord of the Rings. Like, especially in the start of the first book, I was kind of like, okay, Allison, like, I see your inspiration here. But they really, create their own mythology and their own story as the books continue. And the story follows the world's magic users, who are called bards, as they fight against the return of a very Sauron-like Dark Lord type enemy. One of the things that I really love about Gorman's writing is that she's one of the only authors I've read outside of Tolkien who can really evoke this sense of like a truly ancient mystical world that is like both beautiful and bleak and is fading away. The fancy word that I've learned that I think best describes this is like elegiac, like an elegy. So she also creates these really cozy details, which is another thing that I associate with Tolkien a lot. Like the Bard's College in her books, they have all of these kind of lovely rooms and delicious food, and our main character is always like dying to go take a steaming bath and change into clean, soft clothes and then eat like a delicious meal that's described in a lot of detail. So it kind of balances those two things that I really associate with Tolkien really well, and it does tell its own story effectively, I think, too. There are a lot of poems and songs and pieces of writing that are scattered throughout the books that piece together the world's like ancient lore and the history that's come to pass and like have an impact on what's happening in the present. And I believe that Croghan is a poet as well as someone who writes opera music. And so I think you can kind of tell that in some of the music and the poetry that she writes. So this is one from the first book. Glad was the world and golden the greenwood in dawn days of Ulnar, unstained and undarkened, when strode Merk in gold hand, singing in sunlight, lord of a proud people, fearless and prescient, singers of Malden, matchless in magecraft, but master of all was Merkin the maker. Deepest in lore among lordly lore singers, Arestor's firstling, the archmage of artists, tongued with the star speech, speller of seasons, singing the spring on Lyr's silver waters. Long were the days then, and bright laughter lingered, long in the halls where the high people hearkened, lost now in legend, lamented by loremen, reckoning ruins to raise their remembering. Great grew the houses, gilded with glory, over the mere where the milt waters murmured. High then the heart home, where held Merkin hearth feast, gold in the light on the last land of Lyrien. And my next choice is Maria Turchinoff, who's a Finnish author who I believe I've mentioned in a couple of previous videos and like blog posts and things that I've written, because I really love her Red Abbey Chronicles, which is a trilogy about this abbey on an island in a fantasy world that is like a haven for women who are fleeing violence and or want to be scholars. And the trilogy follows first like how the abbey is created, and then hundreds of years later it follows the story of a girl named Marisi who's living at the abbey and then goes back to her home country to try to share what she's learned. And I love this series because of how it talks about violence against women and things like the power of knowledge and education, but it's also really, really beautifully written. You get to see a lot of like the day-to-day life at the abbey and Marisi's village, and there are many details about all of these different places that the different women in the books have come from. You get to see a lot of love for things like the changing of the seasons, and especially with Marisi's books, just how much she loves both the island and her homeland. So I will read from Marisi Redmantle, which is the third book. And it's also an epistolary novel, so that she's writing letters back to the abbey all throughout, which is a really nice effect. So yeah, this is from the third book. Once I had walked the whole western edge of the fields, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, stamping steps, a voice broken to song. It was an ancient ballad that I had not heard before, but I recognized the voice, and it felt like a fire ignited inside me. It was Mother. She was singing an ode to the black swan known in Rovas as Kalma. She presides over death's realm and escorts the dead beneath the silverwood trees and over the great dark lake that rests in stillness beneath their white shining roots. It was a song of darkness and cold and death, but also about how everything has its season, and how, now that it is summer, the swan ought to tuck her head behind her wing and hide her face until her time comes again. Her realm of ice and cold will return when the days are shorter than the nights. After hearing the ballad several times, I was able to join in. The song and Mother's voice gave me the strength to continue, step by step. I wove my own words into the song, words to the crone, my teacher and my friend, my foe in dread. I begged her to leave us be. I begged her to bide her time. I know that I've definitely talked about Juliet Mertel on here before because her books are some of my favorite romances ever. I think she is a great character writer, and she's great at writing relationships between characters, Especially just like so much tenderness and yearning in her romances that it gets me every time. Most of her stories are set in ancient Ireland and Britain, and she has a lot of like druids and bards and folk tales and fae in her stories. They're often like these crumbling castles and these deep forests and characters who have these very spiritual relationships with nature and animals. I would describe her writing as very lyrical, but it's a little bit more straightforward than some of the others that I've mentioned, and I really think what's special is when it combines with the emotional depth of her characters and the relationships. So I'm going to read from Daughter of the Forest. "Look that way," said Red. The place where we stood was the midpoint of a sheltered cove, where the sand was white and fine, and an abundance of low plants scrambled over the cliff face behind. At either end, the tall headlands blocked wind and weather, cutting off the bay from the rest of the world. Before us, a pile of weathered stones divided the beach into two parts. I followed Red's gaze to the left, and my mouth fell open in amazed delight. I had heard of such creatures, but only in tales. They were basking in the summer sun, huge, sleek, elegant in repose. They fixed their great liquid eyes on us as if to say, "This is our place." The mystery of the ocean was in those eyes. There were perhaps 10 or 12 of the creatures there, and as I watched, another came out of the water, moving up the beach with a ponderous grace. It shook its long, heavy body from side to side, and a shower of silver droplets made a dazzling halo around it. Then it settled with a sigh next to its fellows. I sat down very carefully on the rocks, moving slowly in case I startled them, for this was one of those places where the harmony of natural things is quite untouched, where worlds meet and speak, where man and woman must tread with the utmost care. One of the creatures moved its head, watching me, then laid its head and neck across another's back, eyes closing slowly. I felt a grin of pure delight spread over my face. A long time passed as I watched the creatures, as I sat there under the May sky with seabirds wheeling overhead. I felt the power of that place all around me, soaking into me, soothing my spirit, and filling me with joy. It was a feeling not easily told in words, the same feeling that had come to me at times in the deepest, most secret places of the forest, or sitting on the rooftops of Seven Waters, talking to Finbar without any words. All is well, all will be well. The wheel turns and returns. And last but not least is one that I think is definitely a little bit less accessible than the others, but really, really unique and really worth mentioning in this video. That's Greer Gilman, who wrote Cloud and Ashes, a few other things, but this is the one that I've read. And I've never really read anything else like it before. The writing is so like incredibly wild and inventive and poetic, and it combines a lot of very archaic language as well. It won the, what's the name of the award? The Mythopoeic Award, which, if you don't know, Mythopoeic means that it's being related to mythology or the creation of mythology. And that really does describe this book perfectly, because it's essentially about this world's seasonal mythology, like the mythology of the changing seasons, and how that ends up transforming over time with these characters. Like these descriptions of the changing seasons and nature and the magic of the world are just like so extraordinary that sometimes I kind of just like sat back and had to like marvel at what I was reading. One of the blurbs is by Theodora Goss, who's another author who I like, and what she says is, "If you want to see what language can do, the heart-stopping beauty it can achieve, read Cloud and Ashes." And I think that's true. However, I would say the sort of counterweight to that is that it can be a little bit hard to understand at times. It can be very dense, especially in the dialogue, which is in this archaic dialect. And I did see a lot of reviews from people who said like, yeah, I had no idea what I was reading, which wasn't me. Like I definitely walked away from it having a pretty good idea of what was going on. And it was enough of like a special reading experience to me that I think it's one that I'll go back to eventually and hopefully, you know, take even more away from it next time. So I will read to you from the second like part of the book, which is called A Crowd of Bone. Okay. Margaret, do you see the leaves? They flutter, falling. See, they light about you, red and yellow. I am spelling this in leaves. When I had eyes and hands and hair as red as leaves, I was Thea. My mother fed me to her crows. She burned my bones and scattered them. My braided hair she keeps. I am wind and memory who spells this. Thea, who has spelled as stone. My mother got me gazing in her glass. Her raven held it up and told her, "What I tell you, you must do. "Undo," the sly moon said. And so she did, undid. Annis was herself her glass, and I her shadow, A and O. She saw me in the stony mirror, naked as a branch of thorn. Devouring, she bore me, as the old moon bears the new, itself again. But I am left hand to her right, not waning, but the childing moon. The dark has eaten me, I bear its light. I cloak myself in leaves, I fly. The wind unspells this. So that's my list for now. Now that I kind of look at all of the commonalities between these authors, there's definitely a few things that really stand out. I really love an atmosphere that is like very soft and strange and dreamy, and I also love one that is like very dark and ominous and gothic. I love stories that are reminiscent of fairy tales or fairy tale retellings, and also stories that combine these very moving human relationships with lots of small magical details and pieces of lore or poems or like the structure of stories within stories. A lot of them have very strong relationships with nature, and almost all of them have that real sense of like loss or nostalgia or like kind of elegy for mysterious magic or an ancient world. And all of those things are evoked with this really beautiful poetic language in each of these books. I really adore every author and every book that I mentioned here, and yeah, if I can inspire anyone to check them out, then that would really make me happy. I feel like I kind of have done my job for the day. If you want specific suggestions as to which books to choose from any of them, I'm also always happy to talk about that, maybe depending on what kind of specific things you enjoy in your books. And yeah, I might talk a little bit more about just some of the authors that I've seen being described as having this really atmospheric writing or this really poetic writing, who I don't necessarily see doing that. I might do that in another video, but I just felt like doing something really positive for this one and kind of just gushing about these authors who I think are incredibly talented. So yeah, as always, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it anytime anybody does, despite the long time that passes between uploads. And yeah, I just really appreciate you showing up and being interested in what I have to say. And I really hope you take care and show up next time I decide to put something up here. Thank you so much and take care. Bye.